Hello, good afternoon. I'm Allison Brooks, Executive Director of the Bay Area Regional Collaborative, and I served as chair of the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge. You are joining the third webinar in a six webinar series acknowledging or celebrating, marking the 2-year anniversary of the Resilient by Design Bay Area Challenge, which was modeled after Rebuild by Design, and I am delighted to be working with Amy Chester, the Managing Director of Rebuild by Design, on this effort. And I want to thank also Zoe Siegel, who is staff to RBD, who's now working at Greenbelt Alliance, for helping with this, as well as Lucian Go, the BARC Program Coordinator. Today, you're going to hear from a great set of designers and architects working on projects in the Bay Area who were very involved in Resilient by Design. And they're going to be moderated by Amy Hutzel, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the State Coastal Conservancy and who is also Vice Chair of Resilient by Design. It was great to work with her over this project. And I just want to make a few notes. If you have questions, please do share those over the course of the presentation. We would prefer if you could put them in the Q&A section rather than chat, just so we can manage them and make sure we can get to them as quickly as possible. And for those of you who are planning on joining all 6 of these webinars over the full series, you're going to get some kind of special acknowledgement at the end of this. So thank you for everybody who's participating. And I'm going to hand it over to Amy.
Thank you, Allison. And I want to thank everybody who's joining us today for this panel on the role of creeks and natural shoreline solutions in resiliency. And I know it was great experience for me to participate in Resilient by Design. And we're going to be hearing from several of the designers who were involved with Resilient by Design in the Bay Area. I want to again thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank Allison Brooks and Amy Chester and Lucian Go for all the thought and work that's gone into this webinar series celebrating the 2-year anniversary of RBD. And I also really want to thank the 3 speakers today for their role in Resilient by Design and for their ongoing efforts to increase resiliency of our shoreline and creeks and of our communities, really working with nature to increase resiliency around San Francisco Bay. And I'm going to do a quick introduction for the 3 of them, and then they will each speak. We'll have some panel discussion questions after that, and then open it up to Q&A. And again, if you can put your questions in the Q&A and not in the chat, that would help us. John Gibbs is going to speak first. He's a principal at WRT. He's a landscape architect and urban designer whose practice is anchored in the social and ecological processes of our cities and natural areas. And he served as a research advisor for RBD, and thanks for doing that. Gena Wirth is with SCAPE. She's a registered landscape architect and the design principal at SCAPE. She works with cities, community advocates, and landowners to reveal the ecological and cultural potential of public landscapes. And then Richard Mullane with HASSELL is an architect, urban designer, and urban planner with extensive experience leading multidisciplinary teams. He's worked in London, Sydney, and Shanghai before relocating to the Bay Area to establish HASSELL's first studio in the USA. And apologies if you can hear a 10-year-old in the background. But with this, I'm going to mute and turn it over to John.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go ahead and begin to share my screen. We're going to do this very seamlessly because we are practiced. And with that, my screen should be sharing. It is such a pleasure to be here and to be part of this moment of continuing the momentum of the Resilient by Design Challenge in San Francisco from a couple years ago. There was such camaraderie and advancement of a collaborative spirit of intellectual thought at the time. And I think today, as we're in our era of COVID and separation, I really missed that time. So these kinds of moments are really fun for coming together around this common topic. I'm going to be presenting just a couple of projects very briefly, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of themes. I think the interesting components of funding and how we're going to be funding these kinds of projects moving forward. These are very real everyday projects with real clients, real budgets, real challenges in real places. And I think the funding becomes pretty important. There's also really interesting integration of ecology and mobility in a couple of these projects, and I think we're going to see those themes here today. And there's the ongoing reality of how do we pay for these and how do we plan for these sorts of improvements over various planning horizons. And so those real world challenges are very much embedded in here. I just really want to thank RBD. I want to thank the other panelists, and I want to thank my clients for allowing me to present this work and entrusting us with this effort, as well as Poonam Narkar and Christina Bejarano from WRT, as they're very integral here in these projects. Just wanted to begin with I think building off of Resilient by Design, that it's not just about one thing, it's about systems and infrastructure, it's about public health and our access to open spaces, it's about economics. And I think to really underscore the point that it's about people, and we need to pay extra attention to bring equity into this dialogue to make sure all communities are brought along as we face the effects of climate change and sea level rise in particular. I'm going to begin up in the county of Marin with a project really led by the Golden Gate National Parks Conservancy, Marin County Parks, and through their collaboration of One TAM. Those are really the client groups in addition to the Coastal Conservancy. Funding here is from Measure A, but also Caltrans and the Adaptation planning grants. The nature of this project is one of marsh restoration and of trail access, and it requires really the dual leadership, both in planning and design of landscape architecture through WRT, but ESA is a really important key partner, and they're really leading the restoration effects here. So I'm diving into this project before I go to the next one, which really zooms out. In this project, we have a very complex marsh system in Richardson's Bay. Tucked in here is the entrance to Muir Woods, access over to beaches here in the distance. There's a lot of transportation influences. We're looking very specifically at the marsh and at the trail. The marsh is currently in decline. This is a remnant marsh, which was established as it migrated, as the upland areas were developed. There's two creeks that flow into Richardson's Bay, delivering very limited amounts of sediment, and sediment becomes really important as we look more closely at Coyote Creek, and the fact that any sediment that is coming down is really bypassing the marsh. The marsh is not projected to keep up pace with sea level rise. The level of accretion is extremely low. So we have a marsh in decline, not keeping pace with sea level rise, and we have a bay trail. We have an old railroad embankment or levee, which is currently inundated and overtopped. The need to simply repair this to replace the asphalt surface requires great permitting, expense, and effort, and in fact triggers a requirement to elevate the marsh to be resilient to a mid-century point. So right in there becomes this really important story of how do you save a marsh? How do you understand the co-benefits between this levee as a protection of the marsh related to southern storm wave fetch and the erosive effects of waves into the marsh, but also recognize that the lack of influence, tidal influence in and out of this marsh, the reduced tidal prism, is another effect, a negative effect of the Bay Trail and that existing levee. So looking more specifically at the height of that trail, we see a resilience goal of mid-century, so which is mid-century sea level rise plus 100-year storm flood. It's about 5 feet of additional elevation that trail would need to be raised in order to mitigate that effect. And we're right at the point now in our process, as we're really midway, where we're starting to see some co-benefits. We're starting to see the ideas of a raised embankment of ecotone slope, and looking at the level of investment that it would take to achieve that, both through permitting as well as through the dollars and cents and the cost, and what measure of resilience we would have as we were trying to protect the marsh. But of course, we looked beyond that to end of century, and we see even a 5-foot elevation gain in the height of the trail would still not be resilient to end of century. And so we're also looking at elevated bridge structures. We're looking at rerouting the trail, and the broader effects of sea level rise as you look out into that time horizon. So really interesting process for where we are today and where we're going to be going. The engagement has been really interesting, and just huge credit to the client group who's done really all the legwork associated with the engagement, the number of tours, the number of students, folks from Marin City, folks from across Marin County that have come out to learn about the ecology of the marsh. And there's great consensus that something needs to be done, but there's a great lack of clarity, and it's really the goal of our project to provide that roadmap for how this project could move forward, what's the right level of investment to provide protective measures for what planning horizon. So I want to shift gears now and go over to the East Bay shoreline, and huge credit to East Bay Regional Park District as the client that's looking at sea level rise impacts to the Bay Trail through really the entire 40 miles of East Bay shoreline. Interestingly, this project is funded by Caltrans and a transportation grant. It's really because of the recognition of the trail as a mobility function and something to be protected. But of course, it's never that easy. And so again, we have a team of restoration ecologists, coastal engineers, we have ARUP in terms of engineering, but also really detailed skill sets in risk assessment. Our friends at SFEI and leveraging the great work that they do around the Bay, very specifically to this project. And Alexis Robert from On Climate assisting us with partnerships and strategies for funding. So one of the stories about this project is you have 42 miles or sort of over 40 miles of shoreline, you have 2 counties, multiple cities, and a lot of additional miles just of trails along this corridor. So how does East Bay Regional Park District prioritize where it should be directing the greatest resources to protection? And so therein really becomes our project. We have a fixed budget. We've got to cover a lot of territory, and we need to deliver a number of succinct priorities. So leveraging the OLUs from SFEI, the additional work of adapting to rising tides, leveraging that work becomes really important for being able to move projects along efficiently in our San Francisco Bay Area. And there's a great body of work that is out there. Maybe there'll be a few comments and questions later about some of the gaps in that as we've begun to look at the varied conditions. So with all that acreage and mileage, how do we really bring this process through in a succinct way? So we began with an analysis of the full shoreline, and I'll click through some of that research very quickly. We then moved into a risk assessment, narrowing down the priority segments to do additional work on, and ultimately developing a list of about 3 specific projects that really represent the highest priority to East Bay Regional Park District. We're going to leave them, and we began with very high-level guidance across all of those trail segments. We developed a set of goals that were both quantitative and, importantly, were qualitative. We have an incredible brain trust on the team as well as within the client group. So we looked very specifically at hazards and restoration potential. We looked at maintenance. We understood the disadvantaged communities that both rely on the trail for transportation, but also rely on the trail for public access and access to to public health benefits of these areas. We mapped pretty extensively in a number of different ways, and this data set was looking very specifically at both tidal inundation from storm and tides and sea level rise, but also adding the data set from UC Berkeley and others related to groundwater. So mapping this, we began to see impacts to trails, but as you can also imagine, we began to see lots of other impacts all along the East Bay shoreline. And we have a client that is a parks department. And I think that one of the things that this project raises is, you know, there's lots of impacts and it's going to take a lot of different partners. East Bay Regional Park District can't go this alone. And that starts to come out through some of the partnerships and strategies that Alexis Robert has been helping us with as we move into more specific site-specific projects. We looked at the restoration potential. So we looked at nature-based adaptation strategies in addition to just simply a trail. We weren't interested simply in armoring and protecting things in place, but looking at where there was adaptive and nature-based solutions. Where do we have ongoing maintenance issues, so very near-term concerns, critical infrastructure. When we looked very specifically at disadvantaged communities all along the East Bay shoreline and how that began to weigh in and factor into priority segments of the project. Jack Hogan from Arup did just a terrific job with his team looking at the risk assessment, and they led a very specific process on the 8 sites that we had narrowed it down to. And they moved through a very technical process looking at a whole series of coefficients related to hazards, related to vulnerability, consequence, and ultimately a compilation of risk assessment. We took that data forward into then a series of priority sites. So the MLK Shoreline, Alameda Point, Coyote Hills, and in Hayward, those were really the top projects. Interestingly, Gena is going to be speaking next about the Hayward shoreline. And last week, we heard from friends at Methuen talking about North Richmond. So there's actually a lot of nice overlap and support that this rigorous analysis lends to work that's already been done. Ultimately, we're going to be moving forward with specific concepts for specific sites, and importantly, looking at the partnerships, because again, this is not about East Bay Regional Park District going it alone, but how do they join forces with the other assets, whether it's Port of Oakland, or it's the city of Alameda, or in the case of East Shore State Park, adjacent cities, communities, the state of California, and certainly within the MLK shoreline, we're right adjacent to the airport in addition to the city of Alameda. And that wraps up my summary of those projects, and I want to hand it over to Gena.
Great. Thank you, John. I'm just going to bring up my screen here, so hopefully this transitions seamlessly.
Perfect.
You guys see full screen? Great. So thanks so much. That was a really, I think, helpful and very contextualizing presentation, John, and excited to share some related work. I was hoping to share today some of the work that we developed for the Resilient by Design competition and some of the kind of spin-off projects that have really evolved from that. I also just wanted to share a little bit about SCAPE. I put this nostalgic photo of our office in here to show a little bit of who we are. We're about a 50-person design firm located in New York and New Orleans. We're no longer working in the office. We're working from home, but kind of adapting along with the changing world. And we're composed of a mix of landscape architects, urban designers, planners, and horticulturalists, all working in a very interdisciplinary way to think about climate change impacts on society and landscapes. So I thought to take a step back and share some of the work developed for Resilient by Design, particularly our public sediment project, which I think was really important because it had this nested regional kind of research phase, and then a specific project emerged from it. This work was developed with a highly collaborative team led by SCAPE, along with many other excellent practitioners in the Bay Area and beyond. And our team really conceived of the baylands themselves as living infrastructure to be nourished and that can adapt to sea level rise. We knew that tidal baylands, particularly the marshes and mudflats that line the bay's edge, cushion the urban edges and mitigate the risks of sea level rise, and are very important infrastructural features in thinking about adapting to sea level rise. Our team, based upon some work of the Dredge Research Collaborative that set up this project, had identified that sediment is the building block of resilience in the bay. So this was the thesis that we brought to this approach. And many different scientific practitioners in the Bay Area are really looking at this issue of sediment supply. John, you mentioned it, and I think everyone working in the Bay Area on issues of marsh and tidal wetland restoration understand that sediment supply is one important piece of that equation. And that's really because sediment helps build baylands as sea levels rise. Marshes and mudflats and other subtidal ecosystems also need to keep pace with that changing water level so they don't drown or transition to other ecosystem types. And a sediment supply coming in from rivers or streams or tributaries often helps supply that critical sediment to help those marshes grow over time. Historically, our sediment conditions have really changed from what they once were. Historically, tributaries and the San Joaquin and Sacramento rivers really provided large sediment inputs to the bay. But over time, dams and channels, flood control channels, have really trapped and contained sediment and basically divorced the flow of sediment from the flow of water in the Bay Area. And so regionally, this is a probably out of date graphic because in the last year or so, there's been a lot of additional research on this issue, still conveying some of a kind of similar trends that the sediment provided today by the Sacramento and San Joaquin river deltas and the local tributaries of the bay do not provide enough sediment to meet the future potential need to maintain even the existing tidal marshes and mudflats that the bay has today, using this time frame of a 2100 3.5 foot sea level rise scenario. And so our team tried to use that existing research and build on it and visualize it, really thinking about how this could trigger transformative regional scale, bayland, ecological and social change. So thinking about this mosaic of ecosystems that lines the bay and how it might transform into a system predominantly composed of mudflats or subtidal ecosystems and flooded communities over time with this loss of or transformation in ecological composition caused by sea level rise. And so our team really decided to take sediment as a design challenge and think about how can we design with mud, but how can we also make this issue of sediment management and supply a much more public and debated and discussed issue, because often sediment still is thought of as a waste product and not necessarily thought of as a life-giving or ecosystem building material, particularly to, I think, members of the general public. So this was one of our project goals. And rather than focusing purely on the edge, we find that many sea level rise and adaptation projects focus purely on the edge where those impacts might be most apparent. We decided to look upstream to the different tributaries that fed the bay and focus on Alameda Creek, understanding what was once the historical connection between Alameda Creek and its sediment shed and the bay itself, and what is the connection today and what can be done to improve that situation. So we looked at the Alameda Creek watershed, began to zoom in on it, and really looked at the lower watershed where that channelization is truly happening. The lower watershed once historically was a very large mobile alluvial fan. The stream system, the creek system really moved across that entire lowland expanse of the South Bay and deposited sediment that nourished the marshes. Over time, urbanization occurred, shown here in pink, and that creek system was really locked in place. So it no longer could move, it no longer could flood or overtop its banks. The cities of Newark, Union City, Niles, Canyon, and Fremont developed at its edges, and the Army Corps developed a flood control channel in that area to manage water. But the sediment conditions dramatically changed, and the marshes left at the urban edge became salt ponds used for industrial salt production. And today, as some of these salt ponds are being abandoned and their uses are transitioning into restoration projects, their vulnerabilities are exacerbated by climate change because they don't have that important sediment supply to keep pace with sea level rise. So these are some views looking down that channelized creek corridor. You can really see in this particular study area, but also in many tributaries around the bay, there simply isn't a lot of room to reimagine the floodplain to expand out. There's very few places that haven't been urbanized up to the very edge of the creek system. So we're working in a very constrained condition. And you see sediment stuck in the channels. So sediment's really building up within these systems and not getting out to the far expanses of the bay to nourish and resupply these potential marshes at the edges of the creek with sediment that can help them adapt to climate change. And so we worked with many different very important partners on this project because really creeks span many of these like multi-jurisdictional boundaries. Water doesn't always necessarily recognize political boundaries or town boundaries or and we had to really think about what the different partners and landowners and decision makers were in this area and try to bring them into a collaborative conversation about how to improve sediment flows and creek health, as well as build resilience and engage communities in this area. So this is looking kind of in a more zoomed in way at that flood control channel, which, as I mentioned, was not designed to move sediment, which is why you see it in a very shallow condition today because sediment's built up within it. It was also not designed to do things that creeks once did quite well, which is to provide migration space and pathways for migratory species like steelhead that once were kind of very historically prevalent on this creek. You can see this is called the Bart Weir. This is where Bart moves over the creek, but also this weir really prevents fish passage within. And while the channel does have these incredible recreational pathways at its edge, the bed of the channel and the creek itself was not really designed or allowed to engage people. And the conception of people today is that this is not a living ecosystem, that this is a piece of infrastructure, something to stay out and away from, not something to recognize or reflect as a piece of a living system. And so our project really attempted to address these kind of three critical issues, encouraging sediment flows down to the bay to build resilient marshes that could both improve ecological connections, but also help reduce the impacts of sea level rise on lowland communities. It strove to improve the social relationship between people and the creek to view it as a resource and use it more as a resource. And it also really strived to improve migratory passage for fish within the channel and within the larger bay system itself. And so we collaborated with the Flood Control District to brainstorm on different ways that the channel itself might be modified and redesigned to really enable these three different conditions to occur. Kind of resculpting the bed of the channel and stabilizing it with different types of vegetation to encourage a bankful condition that could move more sediment downstream and create a more consistent and sinuous passage for fish migration, particularly steelhead and lamprey within the project area. And so these are just some of the, but also the kind of current clients of the project or proposed clients of the project, that these migratory fish moving both out of the system from upland reserves of steelhead, but also migrating adults trying to move to their upstream breeding grounds. So we thought about how we could design different types of kind of modify the channel in different ways, where possible create spaces that we called flood rooms that would expand the edges of the levee and create space for fish passage and kind of resting spots along the way. Also create a little bit more room within the flood control channel and also create planted pockets and vegetated spaces. We also noticed from a social perspective that in many ways, while the creek for some communities was a beloved recreational resource with the pathways along its edge, the creek also divided many communities and that the people often saw the creek as a barrier within their typical routes of passage and saw it as a way that neighborhoods got broken up and divided up. And so we looked for places where the creek could kind of transform that function and become a connector of different communities. This creek system spans from almost 12 miles up into the upland areas all the way down to the bay. So it's this incredible potential connective spine between regions. And we saw a lot of potential in that to spur more connections at that larger scale, but also hyper locally, connecting pathways from schools, from libraries to the creek itself, and also creating more connections across the creek to really link these different neighborhoods. And so we saw this as part of a very important conversation with the public about building a creek constituency that featured these different elements that we called mudrooms, flood rooms, terrace trails, and seasonal bridges, each one with an outdoor kind of gathering and education perspective that reflected the needs of the community around. And so this work is synthesized in this kind of larger scale rendering and drawing that we called Unlock Alameda Creek, which is about making these more kind of acupunctural changes to the composition of the flood control channel itself for the improved flows of sediment, for improved migration of fish, and for improved social connectivity. So these are just a couple zooms on that area. And I think stepping back, we also built upon some modeling that the Flood Control District had done to understand this type of intervention could help move an additional 5,000 cubic yards of sediment every year to the bay, which could be a very important source of sediment for that long-term slow nourishment of annual sediment coming to the bay and helping these marshes, especially the marshes down at Eden Landing, which is this area here on my screen, be able to keep pace with sea level rise. So down at the marsh's edge, the existing flood control channel doesn't really feed Eden Landing today with sediment. It has levees all along its edge, all the way out to the edge of the bay. And our proposal was to really work with the many different partners working on this large scale restoration project at Eden Landing, the State Coastal Conservancy, in collaboration with many others, including the Flood Control District, to propose this breach to the Army Corps infrastructure. This looks like a very simple move, but is, in reality, a very, very complicated and hotly debated and much discussed type of infrastructure change to occur. It involves a lot of different Army Corps permits and transformation of regulations and maintenance guidelines set to maintain the channel and operate the channel, which everyone is contractually beholden to. It's a very complex conversation, but it would have enormous ecological benefit and really create this transition zone for those migratory fish species using this space to be able to transition from the saltier waters of the bay to the fresh waters of the creek. And we also think it could be nicely nested into a recreational framework for creating a series of pathways and overlooks and educational moments to get people out to the bay to experience these vast and large scale ecosystems. So this represents that kind of full thinking around the project, that interventions far upstream could have a positive, resilient benefit for restoration projects, marshes, these important cushions for the bay edge downstream on the bay. One of the kind of pieces of the project that we ultimately developed into a project that we're advancing now with the State Coastal Conservancy is shown in the foreground here. This is the perimeter levee, and we've called this the Eden Beach Pilot, this gravel beach and berm. And this is related to thinking about how we can design more naturalized shorelines, even where we have highly urban, highly modified, highly built environments. So this kind of perimeter levee in the foreground, we're showing here redesigned as a more naturalized coarse grain and gravel beach system that would be a little bit more dynamic. Today, this system is a riprap perimeter levee. And so our pilot project is really thinking about pilot project in tandem with many important partners, including the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, who really own and operate the property. The project is really thinking about how we can move away from relying purely on riprap and think about more naturalized constructed shoreline conditions that might foster shorebird habitat and other bay ecological life, as well as provide those layers of erosion protection and risk reduction. This work builds on some of the work done by SFEI with the Adaptation Atlas, which identifies this site as a potential site for gravel beaches. And we've been working on this very small scale pilot as a proof of concept of this larger strategy that could be applied to the entire perimeter levee in tandem with the Eden Landing Phase 2 restoration. That is the hope and the goal. And so I can talk more about this in the Q&A. I think it's very, very fine grained. No pun intended, we're looking at a wide variety of grain sizes and material types for this pilot, but it's basically meant to look at a constructed gravel beach system as a replacement for and as a supplement to the existing riprap. And we're testing 2 different beach widths and material compositions to really understand how they perform both from an erosion perspective, erosion control perspective, and a habitat perspective. And so I think I'll end there because hopefully it talks about the large scale aspirations of the overall project and proposal of redesigning sediment flows from upstream to downstream, but also some of the very localized considerations and kind of tests, I think, frankly, that need to happen to be fully prepared for adapting to climate change. And now I will pass it off to Richard, next presenter.
Thanks, Gena. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Colma Creek project, which is an extension of the work that we did within Resilient by Design. I'm going to talk a little bit about Colma Creek itself, but I'm probably going to talk a little bit more generally about our design process and this idea of creating an adaptation toolkit that deals with some of the challenges that many creeks around the bay share, and you know, an attempt that we have to develop design content that might be of value and use to other communities around the bay. So this is Colma Creek in South San Francisco. You hopefully remember it from our Resilient by Design proposal. We are now looking at a sort of a more constrained design scope for a different purpose here. So we're just looking at the creek and the public land adjacent to the creek. And the reason for that is that our sort of grand vision served a purpose to as part of RBD to set people's sites a little further ahead into the future, but it also wasn't all that easily implemented by the local city. And so the city of South San Francisco asked us with continuing work to sort of say, what are the first steps? Like, and what can we do first up to start to implement change along this creek? And it's pretty clear that there's lots of things that can be done along Colma Creek in terms of adaptation. And so this project was funded by an SP1 grant, and then on top of that also a priority conservation areas grant. And the objectives of those grants were aligned, but also slightly different. So the three objectives that we are looking to address within the project are managing flooding and sea level rise impacts and adapting the creek for that purpose, then looking to restore natural and native ecologies along the creek, but also about public access. Colma Creek as a corridor, we identified it as a sort of key link between the community and the shoreline that had been severed by a number of major pieces of infrastructure over time. And not surprisingly, we weren't the first ones to have that idea, and the Plan Bay area also identified this corridor as a key link to the Bay Trail. So that's largely where this project's being funded by. And this was a sort of concept within Resilient by Design that we started us looking at Colma Creek, and that sort of became the motivator for developing a regional toolkit. Is just the number of creeks around the bay and the opportunity for those creeks to connect communities back to the shoreline and to sort of be the first steps in adapting to rising sea levels and overcoming a number of those barriers like freeways and rail corridors that have created this sort of, you know, this circular connection around the cities of the bay and severed that direct access to the waterfront. So the way that we started the project is that we try to bring together our working group around a set of principles and explaining what's our ideal approach to design across a number of different categories. So those three objectives translate into a set of principles in terms of water, ecology, and access. And we've adopted the hashtag Let It Flow because we find it catchy and everybody likes Frozen. We look for opportunities across these different objectives that either align or have conflicts so that we can start that discussion early within the project. And so in terms of water, we're looking at ways that we can increase the capacity of the canal through the shape that we create, but also how that might open up, you know, better visual access to the water. The canal's designed at the moment around a worst case scenario. And so we're looking for ways that we can design it for different levels of inundation that happen sort of daily or annually or every 10 or 100 years. And we're also sort of looking to gradually move from this concrete canal into a naturalized creek. And we understand that there's going to be some hybrid sort of grey-green solutions along the way. In terms of ecology, we really think that there's an opportunity with this project to with all these creek projects to allow people to have access to nature. And that's a key element here in this city with a lack of open space. But we're also importantly trying to design connected nature along this corridor. When we talk about sea level rise and creeks, there's a need for transitioning zones of habitat as a sort of fresh brackish and saltwater zones shift over time along the creek. And with all of that considered, we also want to make very lo-fi solutions so that the community can be involved in planting, participating in the restoration and stewardship of the project. And then finally, in terms of access, it's really about getting people access to the water, but also getting them access along the creek corridor to the shoreline. And there's a number of different constraints around how to make that access equitable across the community and how to make it safe. But there's also lots of opportunity within the corridor to do this in different ways. So looking across our site, I just want to highlight a couple of key maps that drove the project, the FEMA flood zone that exists along the creek, and then also the access piece. So clearly there's an opportunity that if we can solve flooding challenges along the creek, we may be able to deliver more direct access than the city's current bike plan that takes people a long distance from the creek to move to the shoreline. And we started the project in South San Francisco in this stage by looking at the different sections that happen along the creek. So there's a whole range of different conditions, but we looked at 12 typical sections and sort of showed the creek width changing from 40 feet, and changing shape and depth all the way down to sort of, close to 180 feet at the shoreline. And within each of these sections, we also looked at those various flood levels, whether it's a daily water level in the tidal change zone, or whether it's a 10-year flood, a 100-year flood, or even, 1, 2, and 3 foot of sea level rise. And what we were able to do is sort of define different character zones along the creek, and we think these are typical of a number of different situations that occur along all creeks around the Bay Area. So whether that be when a creek runs through a park and there's more opportunities for programming to engage with the creek, or whether there's a street or a linear park running parallel to the creek that offers opportunities for adaptation, all the way through to these sort of tangled intersections of the Caltrain corridor and 101, and the constraints around getting over and under those barriers, and down to the bay where we sort of address sea level rise risks in a kind of completely different profile to what we start with upstream in the park. So our approach has been to sort of build a toolkit, which is a tricky thing because we want to create a wide variety of options for people to apply to different scenarios, but we also want to very clearly explain what the pros and cons are of doing different things in different situations. And so it's a really expansive design process, and there's all sorts of testing of how we can add to and subtract from the existing creek, and how does that relate to the sort of naturalization and restoration effort, and then also how does that relate to the distance that people are from the water or that people are from nature in those restored sections. And we distill all of that into this piece of work that's almost finished. This is in draft format that I'm sharing with you guys, but basically a suite of adaptation options that are defined by those different character zones, and then each of them being assessed against those principles that I mentioned earlier, but really assessed against the 3 high-level objectives of ecology, water, and access or connectivity. So pretty expansive document, but we're also looking to sort of acknowledge the fact that sometimes adaptation may be taking some low-hanging fruit and looking for low-cost, high-impact solutions. And other times it's important that we set a long-term goal and say, we have to completely remove a street in order to expand a creek in an area of particular flood risk or in need of restoration. So I'll quickly skip through some of these areas because we could talk about all sorts of different options. But what we're looking to do is to mix different types of access, whether that be inundatable, like sort of within the flood zone, areas that might go underwater every year or every 10 years, also changing the conditions of the edge in terms of treating stormwater running into the canal, layering that, also retention built into the side of the creek. And then in terms of access, we're sort of playing with how we can get this accessible multi-use path to continually connect between each of these settings. So that includes, you know, sometimes having to move onto street side paths as we go under or around 101, and also using, you know, converting freight line into an accessible trail in order to take advantage of connecting under 101. All the way down to the shoreline, where we're looking at sort of future sea level rise scenarios and the need for migrating marshlands, as well as potentially detention of stormwater separate from protection from sea level rise. So eventually we apply these, the toolkit in Colma Creek to a number of different scenarios, and we sort of look at each of those different zones and creating this continual access path, as well as this sort of transitioning zones of different ecology restoration from the park all the way down to the shoreline. And we assess 3 key scenarios based on investment and return on that investment, but also based on which additional parties need to be brought in to deliver these different routes. So that's been our process. And I just wanted to quickly talk about engagement. We might talk a little bit more in the Q&A about engagement, but we had a really successful engagement program happening last year, and there was a lot of young people in South San Francisco really interested in the project. This is the summer camp that was run in Orange Park, and we had some creek walks going on up and down, and then COVID hit, and so I think it's a really interesting time for community engagement. I think there's a lot of space for innovation. So what we did was we actually used the principles diagrams that explained our approach to create a storybook. Christina lives by a beautiful creek, and the idea of the storybook is that it's told from a future perspective from a young girl that that has a restored creek as sort of like a key part of her daily life in South San Francisco. And we put it online. It's in 4 different languages. We've done a print run of about 200 books that are being distributed around different community groups, the Mothers Group, the Boys and Girls Club. And the bottom left there, you'll see council member Mark Nagalas from South San Francisco with his 2 kids. He did a reading online, and that's been shared by the city, their Parks and Rec department. We sort of took advantage of the fact that parents are stuck at home trying to keep their kids entertained and interested in things, and it's been really successful. So Elizabeth Sunshine and the team at Civic Edge helped to sort of drive the outreach around this piece, but I think it's just one way that we as designers can start to use our design process to sort of directly translate into engagement material, but also how we can use it in these crazy times to keep people engaged in restoration projects and adaptation projects. And on that note, I'll pass back to Amy for the Q&A.
Great, thank you. And thanks to John and Gena and Richard for those fabulous presentations. We did have some questions we wanted to ask the panelists, and lots of great questions are coming in on the Q&A. Gena is typing furiously, answering many of the specific questions about Alameda Creek, which is great, and we'll try to get all these questions answered either right now in the box or live or afterwards and share with everybody. Before we go to some of the Q&A questions, I do just want to ask the panelists, and I'm going to combine a couple of our questions. So, you know, for us, obviously, sea level rise and climate change and adaptation to climate change are critical issues. But you could say that they've been eclipsed recently by other issues such as COVID-19 and the associated stress to public health and to our economy. Obviously, we're also dealing with other social issues in this country that are more pressing on a day-to-day basis to communities, and particularly communities of color and under-resourced communities. So thinking about those crises facing our country and our communities, what impacts do you think those have had on your work and on the public agencies undertaking this work? And in terms of, engaging communities in this long-term adaptation planning, how do you think about that when there are, much larger or more imminent issues impacting communities? So maybe we can just go in the same order. You don't all have to answer, and that's a lot of questions being thrown out there. Yeah, how do we solve all the world's problems? But John, maybe you can take a stab at it.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's definitely one that has challenged my clients and the projects that we're in the midst of. We were really starting to get, I think, within the region and within our culture, a lot of momentum around how we're going to respond to climate change, and in particular sea level rise. And I think that conversation has changed a little bit, but I guess I would argue that we have to be able to do multiple things at once. The fact that the impacts of climate change is going to be affecting all of our populations. And when we think about, beyond COVID and beyond the economic stresses, when we begin to recognize the incredible racial injustice that's been occurring in our country and our communities, and then you think about the impacts of climate change and sea level rise, we're going to be impacting our underrepresented, our underserved communities in incredible ways. And if we're not out in front of that, if we're not advocates for that as part of the work that this panel's just been talking about, I think RBD was engaging with heavily, we're gonna be back in the same boat. So we have to use this moment not to really not to be distracted, but to continue to recognize the broad impacts of sea level rise, and the fact that these things are all related. The disruptions associated with COVID are going to be mild in comparison with future disruptions to health, future disruptions to infrastructure based on the impacts of sea level rise. So if anything, this should be an additional wake-up call, and we're going to continue to see. And I think Hank Ovig did an interesting job talking about this, just the related effects across our globe of climate change. And I think we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. Our clients are immediately impacted. These are parks departments, and their budgets are already thin, and they're burdened with planning for major sea level rise and climate changes within our communities. It's going to take multiple partners, and it's going to take a reprioritization of funding.
Yeah, Don, I totally agree. I mean, I think the climate crisis and the equity crisis are so inextricably linked. You have to talk about them together. We have to be addressing these things together. I guess the thing that I feel like I have no answer for, and I would love to have more kind of group conversation here and other platforms, are what are the ways that projects that are adapting to climate change, whether it's sea level rise or heat, which is a big issue, especially with the COVID crisis like emerging here in New York City, where I am based and I'm located today. How can we begin to tackle these questions, but how can we also rely on innovation and bring innovation and testing and creative thought into these conversations? I think there's a great fear around sea level rise. There's a great fear around urban heat island effect. And there's a desire, I think, to propose things that are well tested, are true, people understand, people acknowledge that have been effective in the past, but yet we see so many ancillary negative impacts from so much of that infrastructure, from levees that disconnect communities and are highly vulnerable, like our office works and has an office in New Orleans, and many disadvantaged populations were obviously very highly impacted by the collapse of what a tried and true engineered levee system proposed to do. And so how do we, in this moment of social kind of reckoning with the climate crisis, do we also think about experimentation and testing new methods and developing new methods collaboratively that address these kind of multi-purpose needs that we all have? I think those are really big questions of how do we experiment and how do we test to do these, because I don't feel like we have the right toolkit of solutions yet to put forward.
Yeah, I'll only add to it quickly so we can get on to another question, but I think it's important that we focus these adaptation projects on underserved communities. I know that we tried to connect our engagement to some sort of understanding of what people are going through sheltering at home, and I think you can see that access to open space is clearly not equally distributed across the region, and that's like really important for mental health. That said, some things these projects just can't address, which are the real inequities around employment, and or there's a whole other side to what's going on, which I don't think we can speak to in some of these projects. It's almost just sort of like two tiers of how this is impacting people, and I just don't want to not acknowledge that some people have lost their jobs and are really, really struggling on a different level to just access to open space. Yeah.
Okay, thank you all. And yeah, we could spend another, well, not just hour, but weeks and months talking about the intersections of many of these issues. But I think it's critical, and it is our work. It's not, I think racial equity is not some, separate thing from the climate change adaptation that many of us are involved in. It's all very tied together and extremely complicated. I did want to switch gears just a little bit, although it's all related. There were some specific questions about the funding for these projects and the status of all three projects in terms of funding and permitting. The status of, I think there was a specific question on that for Alameda Creek. And I'm wondering how you all see it in terms of the schedules and funding for your projects. And there are some sources of funds in the Bay Area for this work, local and regional and state bond funding, even federal funding through the Corps and others, but specifically for your projects, what's the outlook?
Yeah, do you want to go in the same order? Well, I'll just chime in that for the work in Marin, some of that was actually nature-based adaptation funding to specifically promote that, as well as understand restoration. There's also transportation dollars at work there. So I think that's somewhat of a unique project in that it is truly a hybrid of funding sources. Our work in the East Bay is Caltrans funded. It's transportation dollars, and those dollars, though, are being applied towards a resilience strategy for that infrastructure. And I think we're going to see a lot of agencies and municipalities, follow the money. And if it's transportation, we're going to orient it around a bay trail. If it was marsh and restoration, we're going to focus on marsh and restoration. The work has to happen either way.
No, I would echo the kind of transportation funding. It was a project I didn't have time to present, unfortunately, but the work that we're doing that really aligns with a lot of John's work along the Hayward shoreline is also a Caltrans funded project, a climate adaptation grant that came through Caltrans because of the San Mateo Bridge approach. And adjacency of marsh systems, potentially providing some protection to that transportation infrastructure. So these things are very deeply nested. The Alameda Creek project is moving forward in kind of very distinct and different ways. It did get some, diverted some funding from the state for some of the flood control potential improvements. I don't have a great status update on where exactly that is. I think there's still some determination around how that funding will be applied. We were really excited to, with the State Coastal Conservancy, and Amy here received a grant from NIFWIF NOAA Coastal Adaptation grants to advance the gravel beach pilot, to kind of do that more experimental research and design to lead to the implementation of that project. And then I also think some of these projects has also just helped shift the greater conversation around issues of, like in I think our case, like sediment management in the Bay Area, and help enhance like the general perception and the urgency, I think, around many of these questions. And so I think the projects, I think, are valuable in terms of like how they're funded and how they're permitted, but I think the projects are also really valuable in how they're able to influence Bay-wide understanding of potential ways we can adapt, maybe more experimental ways we can adapt beyond the levee walls.
Yeah, similarly, Caltrans funding for us. I think it's fantastic that the freeways might be giving back a little bit, because there's certainly a barrier to creeks all around the Bay. We also are in a fortunate situation that San Mateo County have just been such great leaders in the Bay Area in this space, and they've recently formed the Flood and Resiliency unit, which has had, I think, over 20 cities sign on from the county. So there's a whole new sort of potential stage of adaptation opportunities in San Mateo County, thanks to that leadership from Supervisor Dave Pine and the rest of the county.
So I'm going to have to jump in here. I'm so sorry. This is such a great conversation. It's hard to contain it all within an hour. So many great questions. Thank you, Amy, for moderating, and for Richard, Gena, and John for your excellent presentation. I think everyone really appreciated your presentations and all the information you shared. And you have before you a view of what our session for next week. We're going to dig into work that's been going on in Deep East Oakland. And then also jump back and look at the Adapting to Rising Tides Bay Area project and actually apply some of the findings in that study to the work in East Oakland, all moderated by Professor Christina Hill from UC Berkeley. So I want to thank you all again for your time. Thanks to our presenters, and I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thanks.